As promised, here's an update on the Nigel Farage and his bank accounts being closed scenario, to update as to who the bank is, what the bank said, and what Nigel Farage has said in response to all of that. Now, the BBC reports that Nigel Farage fell below the financial threshold required to hold an account at Coutts, which is known as the prestigious private bank for the wealthy. According to the BBC, Nigel Farage has been told that he was subsequently offered a standard account at, wait for it, Natwest, which owns Coutts. I bet you didn't know that. Probably not the only thing that you won't know that I come across in this video. That would at least go along with what Nigel Farage says he was previously told, in that it was a commercial decision. Because I bet you didn't know this either, that the criteria for holding an account with Coutts is either to borrow or to invest at least £1 million with the bank, or to hold at least £3 million in savings. However, according to the BBC, the bank has declined to comment specifically on Nigel Farage's situation. Now, speaking to the BBC, Nigel Farage has said that he doesn't dispute that he doesn't meet the Coutts threshold for the account, but says, as he's so vocally done on Twitter as well, that they didn't have a problem with it for the last 10 years or so. He's also told the BBC that he was not offered a NatWest account at the time that his Coutts account was withdrawn, and says that the offer of a NatWest account came later in the week. Again, according to the BBC, the offer for the NatWest account still stands, which seems to me to be the most sensible option at the moment, because Nigel Farage says that he's tried to open a number of different accounts. I think it was 9 from the last video that I watched of his, to say that they've all refused him on the grounds that he's a politically exposed person. Now, obviously, a person in that position has a higher risk of financial institutions considering them to be a risk, because they might be exposed to potential fraudulent involvement, bribery, corruption, and all these sorts of things. Not absolutely to say or to suggest that Nigel Farage is involved in any of that. But this is certainly, for someone in his position, something that the bank is likely to take interest in. But also, taking this from a legal standpoint for a moment, let's say that there is a manner of dealing and a course of dealing that has come about between them over the 10 years or so. Even notwithstanding terms and conditions within a contract for the bank to enable them to close an account or to offer him an alternative if he doesn't or no longer meets the wealth requirement. Or indeed, if somebody never met that wealth requirement but were given an account anyway, then there is still, in my humble view, a very question over the fairness of dealing with that individual. Because let's say that this was the case, it is just purely a commercial decision on the basis that he doesn't meet the wealth criteria. But let's say he hasn't done so for many years. I don't know that that's the case or not. He just says, and I can infer, he says that he doesn't dispute the fact that he does not meet the Coutts threshold, but they didn't have a problem with it for the last 10 years. Suggests to me that he didn't meet that for the last 10 years. That's obviously not a statement of fact. That's just my inference from what he said, according to the BBC, of what he said to the BBC. So, assuming that that's the case, and he hasn't met this threshold for the last 10 years, then there is still, in my view, a question to take to the Financial Ombudsman Service to say that he's been treated unfairly if they've suddenly, to coin a phrase, pulled the rug, because now they've decided that they don't want to offer an account to somebody that doesn't meet the threshold, even though they haven't met the threshold for the last 10 years. So there is still a question to be answered there as to whether that was fair, in the sense that NatWest owns Coutts and he's been offered, reportedly, a NatWest standard account. Then probably the Financial Ombudsman would conclude that that was a fair alternative if they are still offering him a solution to his banking needs and just not the account that he's always had. So if all that being the case, then there probably isn't a valid complaint to the Financial Ombudsman Service for being unfair. Still a question mark, but probably not a resolution in his favour. If indeed that is all the truth, because I understand from Twitter, from Nigel Farage's own video, which you can go and seek out for yourself, that he has different views as to how this has all gone down. But this, at least according to the BBC, is Coutts' position and that of NatWest. But it still doesn't go to explain, as I've talked about in my previous videos, clients of ours that have had accounts closed and frozen because they've been suspected of being involved in some kind of fraudulent or otherwise criminal activity. Even if somebody reports a transaction as being suspicious or fraudulent, the bank will routinely freeze that account until sufficient evidence is shown to their satisfaction that there's no wrongdoing and there's no involvement or even any suspected involvement in any fraudulent or criminal activity. Whilst it is right that the banks need to comply with money laundering requirements, and there are significant penalties for doing so, so the banks are very hot at doing this and preventing money laundering and everything else, because of course it finances crime and terrorism and all sorts of other things. So the banks are absolutely hot on preventing that from happening. But that doesn't mean that it isn't a problem. And I just think, for what it's worth, there should be an additional route to resolve these things rather than just wiping out a customer's access to all accounts if they are just suspected of being even tangentially involved in some kind of transaction that ultimately roots back to some criminal origin. I think there should be some additional measure there, because certainly in at least one of our cases, I was not the only lawyer on this case, and there was very little we could do about it. The banks just didn't reply. We didn't get any reply from the bank, we didn't get any resolution, and so far as I know, that was it, because the client couldn't afford to continue with lawyers to chase it down, much less take them to court. So here's what happened. Now, my client was planning to recoup and raise some funds from their personal effects, their personal belongings. But because they were not particularly good at doing so, they solicited the help of a family member to help them sell those goods. Now, in the middle of all that, some of the goods were sold and some money was paid into their account. A little while later, my client received a call from the bank to explain where this money had come from. My client explained that it was a result of selling some personal effects, raising money through a family member, and whoever bought them paid the money into their account. The bank still wanted to know where the money came from. My client said, "That's all I can tell you. I sold some stuff, a family member helped me, and the money was paid into my account." My client had withdrawn some money and spent some of it, and the bank again wanted to know where that money went that was spent, and a full explanation. My client could not explain, any more than I've just explained to you, where the money came from. The bank, on not being satisfied of the explanation provided by my client, closed the account. Not only did they close the account, they placed my client on the database for fraudulent activity. So I do know that in some situations this is going to be an ongoing problem, even if the customer is entirely innocent in the whole deal. But that's the brief update, breaking literally 40 minutes ago as I sit here now from the BBC. That's the update with regards to Nigel Farage. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe all this? Do you think there's more to it? And let me know your experiences with banks and what's happened to you. In the meantime, please smash the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.